It was a scene that shattered the silence of a gleaming Manhattan skyscraper lobby, a group of wealthy office workers laughing cruelly as they mocked the janitor whose tired eyes quietly scanned the polished floors. They ridiculed his worn clothes, his hesitant smile, and the humble bucket he pushed behind him. The laughter echoed, passing like a cold wind, leaving a still emptiness that stretched far beyond the marble walls. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sweeping a hallway, checking cameras, or locking the building for the night. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise you, today's story will shake you to your core. In the heart of Manhattan, where glass towers pierce the sky like steel prayers to prosperity, Henry Martinez had become invisible. At 63, his weathered hands carried the memory of 4 decades spent cleaning the same marble floors, polishing the same brass fixtures, and witnessing the same parade of tailored suits and designer heels click past him as if he were part of the architecture itself. His uniform, navy blue and pressed with military precision despite its age, hung loose on his diminishing frame, a testament to the man who still believed in dignity even when the world had forgotten his name. The Caldwell Tower, a 40-story monument to new money and old arrogance, hummed with the electricity of millions changing hands daily. Stock market deals worth more than Henry's lifetime earnings were negotiated in elevators between floors. Bitcoin transactions flowed through smartphones like digital rivers of gold, while Henry's weekly paycheck barely covered his modest rent in Queens. He had watched fortunes rise and fall from behind his mop bucket, seen cryptocurrency millionaires celebrate one day and weep the next, observed as real estate investments made men gods in the morning and beggars by evening. Yet through it all, Henry remained, steady, silent, present. His routine began at 5:30 each morning, when the subway carried him from his small apartment past the sleeping neighborhoods where people like him lived. Nurses finishing night shifts, security guards heading home, maintenance workers beginning their invisible dance through the city's veins. By 6:15, Henry would unlock the heavy glass doors of Caldwell Tower, breathing in the scent of marble cleaner and possibility. The lobby stretched before him like a cathedral of capitalism, its soaring ceiling painted with murals depicting the American dream in gold leaf and ambition. Leonard Caldwell III owned the building, though he visited irregularly, preferring to conduct his multi-million-dollar real estate empire from his penthouse office or his estate in the Hamptons. When he did appear, trailing the scent of expensive cologne and entitlement, his presence changed the building's atmosphere like a stone thrown into still water. Employees straightened their spines, conversations hushed to respectful whispers, and Henry became even more invisible, if such a thing were possible. Leonard's wealth came from generations of shrewd investments in Manhattan properties, a portfolio that now included cryptocurrency ventures and offshore assets worth hundreds of millions. To him, Henry was simply part of the building's operational costs, like electricity or heat, necessary but unremarkable. The morning that changed everything had started like countless others. Henry arrived to find the lobby already buzzing with tension. Miriam Caldwell, Leonard's 38-year-old daughter and reluctant heir to his empire, stood near the reception desk, her designer heels clicking an anxious rhythm on the polished floor. She managed a hedge fund downtown, her own fortune built through calculated risks in the stock market and emerging technologies like blockchain investments. Yet despite her financial independence worth several million in assets and securities, she remained trapped in the orbit of her father's expectations, forever seeking approval that never came. "The Qing dynasty vase," she was saying to the building manager, her voice tight with worry. "It's been in our family for generations. Father will be furious if anything's happened to it." The vase in question sat in a place of honor in the building's private gallery, a testament to the Caldwell family's taste for acquiring beautiful things. Its value exceeded Henry's annual salary by 20 times over, a reminder of the vast chasm between their worlds. Henry had noticed the vase every morning for years as he cleaned the gallery, Sometimes he would pause, dustcloth in hand, and study its delicate blue patterns depicting ancient Chinese landscapes. There was something peaceful about those painted mountains and rivers, a serenity that contrasted sharply with the harsh angles of modern wealth surrounding it. He had always been careful around it, understanding that his careless touch could destroy something irreplaceable. Yet that morning, as he approached with his usual reverence, his heart stopped. The vase lay in pieces on its pedestal, shards of porcelain scattered like broken promises across the mahogany surface. The delicate neck had snapped cleanly, while spiderweb cracks spread across the body like tears frozen in ceramic. Henry's hands trembled as he set down his cleaning supplies, his mind racing through the previous evening. He had left everything perfect, as always. The gallery had been pristine, the vase intact and beautiful in the amber light of the security lamps. Within minutes, the gallery filled with voices. The building manager arrived first, followed by Miriam, then several office workers drawn by the commotion. Their eyes swept the scene and landed on Henry with the inevitability of gravity. He stood there, still as stone, his weathered face reflecting decades of accepting blame that wasn't his to bear. The whispers began immediately, speculations about his carelessness, his age, his declining abilities. Someone mentioned that he'd been working too many hours lately, that perhaps it was time for him to retire. "I didn't touch it," Henry said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "It was perfect when I left last night." But his words fell into the marble space like pebbles into an ocean, creating no ripple, changing nothing. The narrative had already been written in their minds. The old janitor, tired and clumsy, had finally made the mistake they'd all been expecting. Leonard Caldwell arrived within the hour, his presence filling the gallery like storm clouds. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suit worth more than most people's cars, his watch a Swiss masterpiece that cost more than Henry's annual income. At 65, Leonard carried himself with the confidence of a man whose investment portfolio had survived every market crash since the 1980s, whose real estate holdings stretched from Manhattan to Miami Beach, whose cryptocurrency ventures had multiplied his wealth exponentially during the digital gold rush. He surveyed the broken vase with the cold calculation of a man accustomed to quantifying loss in dollars and cents. 40 years, Leonard said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. This vase survived 40 years in this building, through renovations and relocations, and now— He turned his glacier blue eyes on Henry. "How long have you worked here, Martinez?" 38 years, sir," Henry replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He had watched this man inherit his father's fortune, had cleaned these floors when Leonard was a young executive learning the family business, had been present, but invisible through every triumph and setback of the Caldwell empire. 38 years, Leonard repeated, tasting the irony. And in all that time, nothing like this has ever happened. Strange coincidence, don't you think? The accusation hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the space between them. Henry felt the familiar weight of being judged not by his character or his decades of faithful service, but by his position, the convenient scapegoat, the expendable employee. The humiliation that followed was swift and brutal. Leonard announced Henry's suspension in front of the gathered crowd, his words echoing off the marble walls like a public execution. "We cannot tolerate carelessness with irreplaceable family heirlooms," he declared, as smartphones discreetly captured the moment as office workers exchanged glances that mixed pity with self-preservation. "Pending a full investigation, Mr. Martinez is suspended without pay." Henry stood there, absorbing each word like physical blows. Around him, the building's elite inhabitants whispered their theories. That age had caught up with him, that his steady hands had finally failed, that perhaps they had all been too generous in overlooking his limitations. Some showed false sympathy. Others barely concealed relief that it wasn't them facing Leonard's wrath. But none asked the questions that mattered. Who else had access to the gallery? What did the security cameras show? Why would a man who had spent 4 decades protecting beautiful things suddenly destroy one? As security escorted him out, Henry clutched his worn leather keyring, the tangible symbol of the trust he had earned and lost in a single morning. The keys felt heavier than usual, each one a memory of locked doors he could no longer open, of responsibilities he would no longer fulfill. The brass was tarnished from years of use, the leather soft from the oil of his palms. Among them was a key that most had forgotten existed, access to the building's oldest storage room, where outdated security equipment gathered dust and memories. The subway ride back to Queens passed in a blur of underground darkness and fluorescent light. Henry sat among the morning commuters, nannies heading to Upper East Side apartments, construction workers bound for building sites, security guards beginning their shifts. These were his people, the invisible army that kept the city functioning while others slept. Yet, even among them, he felt isolated by his shame, marked by the morning's events like a scarlet letter stitched into his uniform. His apartment in Astoria was small but clean, a studio that reflected his modest needs and careful maintenance of what little he owned. The walls held photographs of a life lived quietly. His late wife Maria, their daughter Rosa, who lived in California with her own family, grandchildren he saw twice a year at Christmas and birthdays. Maria's sewing machine still sat by the window, though she had passed 3 years ago from diabetes complications they couldn't afford to treat properly despite his health insurance. Sometimes, Henry would sit there in the evening, remembering her gentle warnings about the wealthy people he worked for. "They will never see you as human," she had said in her accented English, her fingers working thread through fabric with the same precision Henry used on marble surfaces. "To them, we are furniture, useful when we work, disposable when we don't." Her words echoed now with prophetic accuracy, a wisdom born from her own years, cleaning houses for Manhattan families who knew her first name but never asked about her dreams. For 3 days, Henry remained in his apartment, wrestling with emotions that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. Pride warred with practicality. Should he fight the accusation or accept defeat gracefully? Anger battled with forgiveness. These people had never shown him respect. Why should he protect them now? Yet beneath it all, a different truth whispered in his mind. He knew that building better than anyone, understood its rhythms and secrets, its hidden corners and forgotten spaces. And somewhere in that knowledge lay the key to his vindication. The building's oldest storage room occupied a forgotten corner of the basement, tucked behind the mechanical systems that kept the tower's 40 floors humming with life. Henry had discovered it during his first year of employment, when curiosity had led him through doors marked with warnings about authorized personnel only. The room contained decades of obsolete equipment, old television monitors, abandoned security systems, filing cabinets full of maintenance records that no one had bothered to digitize or destroy. Among this technological archaeology, Henry had once found something interesting: an ancient security camera system that predated the building's current digital network. The cameras themselves had been removed during a renovation 15 years ago, but the recording equipment remained, its magnetic tape still spinning silently in metallic rhythm. Most people had forgotten it existed, assuming that modern IP cameras had completely replaced the old system. But Henry remembered, because Henry remembered everything. The key turned smoothly despite years of disuse, the lock clicking open with mechanical precision. Inside, dust motes danced in the weak light from a single bulb, and the air smelled of old electronics and forgotten time. The recording system hummed softly in its corner, LED indicators blinking green to show it was still receiving feeds from cameras everyone thought were disconnected. Henry's hands shook as he rewound the tapes to the night before the vase broke, his fingers working controls that felt familiar despite the years. The footage was grainy and gray, captured by a single camera that covered part of the gallery through a maintenance corridor window. For hours, Henry watched nothing more interesting than the play of shadows and security lighting across marble floors. But then, at 11:47 p.m., a figure appeared in the frame. The image was blurry, distorted by the old camera's limitations and the corridor's lighting, but the person moved with purpose toward the gallery. Henry's breath caught in his throat as he watched the figure disappear from view, then return 20 minutes later, walking more quickly now, shoulders hunched with urgency. The timestamp showed that this had happened 4 hours after Henry's shift ended, during a period when the building should have been empty except for overnight security. Someone with access, someone with keys or codes, had entered the gallery in the dead of night and done something that resulted in the vase's destruction the next morning. Henry rewound and watched again, squinting at the screen, trying to discern any identifying details. The figure wore dark clothing and moved carefully. But there was something familiar about the walk, the posture, the way they carried themselves. As he sat in that dusty room, surrounded by the ghosts of obsolete technology, Henry felt the first stirring of something he hadn't experienced in decades: hope. Not the desperate hope of a condemned man, but the quiet confidence of someone who knew the truth and could prove it. The tape cartridge was small enough to fit in his jacket pocket, but its contents were powerful enough to shatter the assumptions that had branded him a careless old fool. Yet even with evidence in his hands, Henry faced a dilemma that went deeper than simple vindication. The security system's existence would surprise many people at Caldwell Tower, including those who might prefer certain activities to remain unrecorded. Using this footage meant revealing a surveillance capability that others had forgotten or chosen to ignore. More importantly, it meant stepping out of his comfortable invisibility and forcing people to see him, not as furniture or background, but as a human being with intelligence, dignity, and the power to change their carefully constructed narrative. The building continued its daily rhythm without him, though subtle signs of his absence began to appear like cracks in a well-maintained facade. The brass handrails lost their mirror shine, fingerprints accumulated on glass surfaces that had always been spotless, and the marble floors developed a dullness that spoke of hurried cleaning by replacement workers who lacked Henry's decades of experience. Leonard Caldwell noticed these changes with the irritation of a man accustomed to perfection, though he would never admit that a janitor's absence could affect his empire's presentation. More pressing concerns occupied Leonard's attention as autumn arrived early in Manhattan, bringing with it financial storms that threatened the foundation of his carefully built wealth. A series of risky cryptocurrency investments had backfired spectacularly when the market collapsed, wiping out nearly $40 million in digital assets overnight. Real estate deals that had seemed certain began falling through as interest rates climbed and investors grew cautious. The stock market portfolio that formed the backbone of his family's fortune began hemorrhaging value as technology companies faced regulatory scrutiny and economic uncertainty. For a man whose identity was inseparable from his net worth, these losses cut deeper than mere numbers on financial statements. Leonard found himself working 18-hour days, desperately trying to shore up his crumbling investment pyramid. He moved millions between accounts like a desperate gambler, selling properties at losses to cover margin calls, borrowing against assets that were declining in value even as he pledged them as collateral. The financial media began whispering about the Caldwell family's troubles, their gossipy articles adding public humiliation to private devastation. Miriam watched her father's decline with growing concern and complicated feelings of her own. Her hedge fund had also suffered in the market downturn, though her more conservative investment strategy had protected her from the worst losses. She possessed enough liquid capital to potentially help her father, but their relationship had been strained for years by his dismissive attitude toward her business acumen and his inability to see her as anything more than an eventual heir to his legacy. The broken vase incident had only widened the gulf between them, as she privately questioned his harsh treatment of Henry while publicly supporting his decision to maintain family honor. The investigation into the vase's destruction had stalled almost immediately. Security footage from the modern cameras showed nothing unusual, as the gallery lay in a blind spot between coverage areas, architectural detail that Leonard now cursed as short-sighted cost-cutting. Interviews with night security yielded no useful information, and the building's electronic access logs showed only authorized personnel using their key cards during normal hours. Without evidence of external break-in or obvious internal sabotage, the case seemed to prove Henry's guilt by elimination. He was the most recent person known to have been near the vase, and accidents happen when people age beyond their capabilities. Yet, something nagged at Miriam's mind as weeks passed without resolution. She had inherited her father's sharp intelligence and her grandmother's intuitive understanding of human nature, and both told her that the official story felt incomplete. Henry Martinez had worked in their building since she was a child, had been present but invisible through her entire life. She remembered him from her teenage visits to her father's office, always polite, always careful, always treating the building's treasures with reverence rather than casual familiarity. Would such a man suddenly become clumsy after 38 years of impeccable service? The answer came on a gray October afternoon, when Miriam found herself alone in the gallery, studying insurance papers related to the broken vase. As she stood where the piece had displayed for decades, she tried to imagine the accident that had supposedly destroyed it. Henry would have been cleaning this area at dawn, the morning light streaming through the windows, his usual routine guiding him through familiar tasks. But the vase's position on its pedestal was awkward for cleaning, tucked back far enough that reaching it would require deliberate effort rather than accidental contact. More puzzling was the pattern of damage she remembered from that terrible morning. The vase had broken cleanly in some places, as if struck with precision, while other areas showed the scattered damage of impact with the pedestal. It looked less like the result of a cleaning accident and more like vandalism attempted to appear accidental. Someone with knowledge of the vase's value and significance had wanted it destroyed while maintaining plausible deniability about the destruction. These thoughts occupied her mind as she walked through the building's corridors, seeing cleaning staff who moved with conscious efficiency rather than Henry's unconscious grace. The replacement janitors were competent but unremarkable, lacking the institutional memory that Henry had embodied. They knew how to clean, but they didn't know the building's personality, which elevator buttons stuck, which windows leaked during heavy rains, which tenants preferred their offices spotless versus those who barely tolerated cleaning at all. The building functioned, but it no longer hummed with the quiet perfection that Henry's presence had provided. That evening, as Miriam sat in her Tribeca apartment reviewing financial reports, an unexpected visitor interrupted her solitude. The doorman announced Henry Martinez, and her heart raced with surprise and curiosity. She hadn't spoken to him since the morning of his dismissal, had only glimpsed him occasionally over the years when he worked quietly in the background of her father's world. Now he stood in her granite and steel living space, humble and dignified despite the shabby coat that spoke of financial hardship since losing his job. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice carrying the formal respect of 4 decades serving her family. "I apologize for disturbing your evening, but I have something you need to see." From his jacket pocket, he withdrew a small tape cartridge, its metal surface dulled by age but its contents potentially explosive. "There are things about your building that your father has forgotten, security measures that still watch when he believes no one is looking." As Miriam listened to Henry's quiet explanation of the forgotten camera system and what it had recorded, she felt the earth shifting beneath her assumptions about guilt and innocence, about the reliability of official stories and the invisible wisdom of overlooked people. The tape he offered represented more than evidence of his innocence. It was proof that her father's empire rested on foundations he no longer fully understood, maintained by people he had taught himself not to see. The playback equipment required a visit to an electronics store that specialized in obsolete formats, but eventually Miriam watched grainy footage that changed everything. The figure moving through the gallery corridors was blurry but familiar, and when she enhanced the image using modern digital techniques, her stomach dropped with recognition. The person who had destroyed the vase and allowed Henry to take the blame was someone she trusted, someone with everything to gain from the old janitor's disgrace and everything to lose from his continued presence in their world. The truth was more bitter than she had imagined, and it cast shadows over relationships she had considered unshakable. Yet, as she sat in her apartment that night, reviewing the evidence that would vindicate Henry and expose the real culprit, Miriam felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the clear moral certainty that comes from choosing justice over convenience, truth over comfortable lies. Her father might be facing financial ruin, but she could still save his honor by correcting a terrible wrong committed in his name. The confrontation came 3 days later in Leonard's office, the confrontation Miriam had been both dreading and anticipating since discovering the truth about the vase. Her father sat behind his mahogany desk like a king on a crumbling throne, financial reports scattered around him like battle plans for a war he was losing. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows seemed harsher than usual, illuminating the lines of stress that recent months had carved into his face. At 65, Leonard Caldwell looked older than his years, worn down by the weight of protecting an empire that seemed determined to collapse despite his best efforts. "I need to show you something about the vase," Miriam said without preamble, connecting her laptop to the large screen mounted on the office wall. The familiar gallery appeared on the monitor, captured by a camera system her father had forgotten existed. As the timestamp advanced to 11:47 p.m. on that fateful night, a figure emerged from the shadows with purposeful movement. Leonard leaned forward, squinting at the grainy image. Where did this footage come from? Our security system doesn't cover this angle. His voice carried the sharp attention of a businessman who had built his fortune by noticing details others missed, by understanding systems and their vulnerabilities. But there was also wariness there, the caution of a man who had learned that secrets could emerge from forgotten corners to destroy carefully constructed realities. "Henry Martinez found it," Miriam explained, her voice steady despite the significance of what she was revealing. "There's an old recording system in the basement that nobody remembered to disconnect. It's been running for 15 years, watching parts of the building through cameras everyone thought were removed." She paused the video as the figure reached the gallery, their face still obscured, but their posture recognizable to anyone who knew them well. "That's impossible," Leonard said, but his tone suggested he was beginning to understand that impossible things had been happening in his building without his knowledge. "Martinez is just a janitor. How would he know about old security equipment?" The question revealed the breadth of his blindness. How could someone he had never truly seen possess knowledge that escaped his attention? How could the invisible man understand his building better than he did? "He's worked here for 38 years, Miriam replied quietly. "He's been in every room, every closet, every forgotten corner. While we were managing portfolios worth millions in cryptocurrency and real estate investments, while we were tracking every dollar and euro in our accounts, he was learning the building's secrets, not because he was spying, but because he cared about this place in ways we never bothered to notice." The video continued, showing the figure's movements through the gallery. Enhanced digital processing had sharpened the image enough to reveal identifying details: the expensive Italian shoes, the characteristic way of walking that spoke of confidence and entitlement, the designer watch that caught the security lighting as an arm reached toward the precious vase. When the figure turned slightly, their profile became unmistakable despite the poor image quality. Leonard's face went ashen as recognition dawned. The person destroying the vase, the individual responsible for Henry's disgrace and dismissal, was someone he trusted absolutely: his personal assistant and financial advisor, Thomas Richardson. A man who had managed portions of Leonard's investment portfolio, who had access to building security codes, who knew the family's treasures and their emotional significance. More importantly, Thomas was someone who had been quietly embezzling funds from Leonard's accounts for months, skimming cryptocurrency transactions and redirecting dividend payments into hidden offshore accounts. "Dear God," Leonard whispered, understanding flooding through him like cold water. Thomas had been stealing from him systematically, using his position of trust to gradually drain assets while covering his tracks through complex financial manipulations. The total theft exceeded $2 million, enough to buy a comfortable retirement or escape prosecution by fleeing to a country without extradition treaties. But Henry's sharp eyes and careful attention to building details posed a threat to Thomas's plans. The old janitor saw everything, remembered everyone who entered and left, noticed patterns that others missed. By destroying the vase and framing Henry for carelessness, Thomas had accomplished multiple goals with surgical precision. He eliminated a potential witness who might remember his unusual after-hours visits to Leonard's office, where Thomas had been accessing computer systems to cover his digital trail. He created a crisis that would distract Leonard from careful examination of his accounts, providing cover for the final phases of the embezzlement. Most crucially, he removed Henry from the building permanently, ensuring that the one person who might notice discrepancies between Thomas's official schedule and his actual presence would no longer be there to observe. The elegance of the scheme was matched only by its cruelty. Thomas had calculated that Leonard's pride would never allow him to admit error in publicly humiliating Henry, that the Caldwell family's reputation would take precedence over fairness to a mere janitor. He had counted on their blindness to serve people's humanity, their assumption that those of lower social class possessed neither intelligence nor integrity worth considering. In this calculation, Thomas had been absolutely correct until now. "We have to find Martinez immediately," Leonard said, his voice ragged with understanding of the injustice he had committed. "We have to make this right." But even as he spoke, the magnitude of the correction required became overwhelming. How do you undo a public humiliation? How do you restore dignity that has been systematically destroyed? How do you apologize to someone you have never bothered to truly see? The search for Henry Martinez proved more difficult than Leonard had anticipated. The address in his employment file led to a Queens apartment building where a neighbor mentioned that he had moved out weeks earlier, leaving no forwarding information. His daughter Rosa, contacted in California, was polite but protective, explaining that her father had been deeply hurt by recent events and was taking time to consider his future. She didn't trust Leonard's sudden interest in making amends, and her skepticism was well-founded given the family's treatment of her father. Meanwhile, Thomas Richardson had vanished as completely as the money he had stolen. His apartment was empty, his bank accounts closed, his luxury car found abandoned at JFK Airport. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit began tracing his movements through cryptocurrency transactions and offshore banking records, but Thomas had planned his escape carefully. He possessed enough stolen funds to remain hidden indefinitely in countries where Leonard's wealth and influence carried no weight. For the first time in his adult life, Leonard faced consequences that could not be resolved through negotiation or financial leverage. The truth about the vase had emerged, but it brought with it a reckoning that extended far beyond a simple apology. His empire continued crumbling as investigators froze assets connected to Thomas's embezzlement, as clients lost confidence in his ability to protect their investments, as family members questioned his judgment and leadership. The broken vase had become a symbol of how quickly trust could shatter and how difficult it was to repair once the fragments were scattered. 3 weeks passed before Miriam located Henry through careful detective work and persistent kindness. She found him at a small Catholic church in Jackson Heights, where he had been volunteering as a maintenance worker while staying in a room provided by the parish priest. The church was modest, but beautiful, its stained glass windows casting colored light across worn pews where working-class families gathered for services conducted in Spanish and English. Here, among people who understood the value of quiet dignity and honest labor, Henry had found temporary peace. Father Miguel, the parish priest, spoke of Henry with genuine affection as they sat in his small office behind the sanctuary. "He appeared at our door like an answer to prayers," the elderly priest explained in accented English. "Our previous custodian had fallen ill, and we couldn't afford to hire professional help. Henry offered his services in exchange for room and meals, but he has given us far more than we could provide in return. The church has never looked more beautiful. Indeed, the sanctuary gleamed with care that went beyond mere cleaning. The brass fixtures shone like gold, the marble altar reflected light like still water, and every surface showed the attention of someone who understood that maintenance was a form of worship. Henry had brought to this humble place the same reverence he had once given to Leonard's tower, but here his efforts were noticed and appreciated by people who saw him as essential rather than invisible. When Miriam finally spoke with Henry, she found him changed by the events of recent months. The shame and confusion that had marked his face during the vase incident had been replaced by a quiet strength that came from knowing his worth regardless of others' opinions. He listened to her explanation and apology with the grace of someone who had learned to forgive without forgetting, to extend mercy without surrendering dignity. "Your father," Henry said carefully, "has never seen me as a person. To him I was equipment that cleaned his building, furniture that moved and spoke but had no thoughts worth considering. I don't expect that to change now, even with proof of my innocence." His words carried no bitterness, only the resignation of someone who understood his place in a world that valued him for his function rather than his humanity. But Miriam persisted, explaining not just her father's remorse, but his practical need for Henry's expertise. The building continued deteriorating without his institutional knowledge, and the staff hired to replace him lacked his understanding of the structure's quirks and requirements. More importantly, Leonard faced financial investigations that would scrutinize every aspect of his business operations. Having Henry return as more than a janitor, as someone with real authority and respect, would demonstrate to investigators and clients that Leonard was serious about rebuilding trust and integrity in his organization. The offer that Miriam presented was unprecedented in Henry's experience. Director of Building Operations, with authority over all maintenance staff, a salary comparable to middle management positions, and a place in the decision-making process for building policies. It represented not just vindication, but transformation. From invisible worker to visible leader, from blamed scapegoat to trusted advisor. Yet Henry's response was characteristically thoughtful rather than immediately grateful. "I will consider your offer," he said finally, "but not because I need your father's approval or his money. I will consider it because this building was my life's work for nearly 4 decades, and I believe I can help it become something better than it has been." His conditions were simple. Thomas Richardson must face prosecution for his crimes, a public acknowledgement of Henry's wrongful termination must be made, and all building staff must be treated with dignity regardless of their position or background. The return of Henry Martinez to Caldwell Tower 3 months later resembled a quiet revolution more than a simple rehiring. Leonard had agreed to all of Henry's conditions, and the changes were immediately visible to everyone who entered the lobby. The marble floors gleamed with renewed life, the brass fixtures reflected light like mirrors, and the very air seemed cleaner and more welcoming. But more significant were the changes in atmosphere and culture that Henry brought to his new role. Staff meetings that had once been exercises in top-down authority became collaborative discussions where maintenance workers' observations were valued alongside managers' reports. Henry instituted training programs that taught all employees about the building's history and architecture, creating pride in their workplace that extended far beyond paychecks. He implemented efficiency measures learned from decades of experience, reducing operating costs while improving service quality. Most importantly, he modeled a leadership style based on respect rather than intimidation, visibility rather than hierarchy. Leonard observed these changes with emotions that mixed gratitude with humility. His financial situation had stabilized somewhat as investigators recovered portions of Thomas's stolen assets and as clients began returning confidence to his rebuilt organization. The cryptocurrency market had partially recovered, restoring some of his digital investments, while his real estate portfolio showed signs of renewed strength. Though his net worth remained well below its previous peaks, he had learned to measure wealth in different terms: integrity, trust, and the loyalty of people who chose to work with him rather than for him. The relationship between Leonard and Henry evolved slowly but profoundly. What began as formal correctness gradually became genuine respect, as Leonard discovered that the man he had dismissed as mere furniture possessed insights about business operations, human management, and practical problem-solving that MBA programs never taught. Henry's recommendations saved thousands of dollars in operational costs while improving working conditions for all staff. His careful attention to building maintenance prevented expensive repairs by catching problems before they became crises. More personally, Leonard began to understand how his privilege had blinded him to the humanity of people who served him. Henry's quiet dignity and competent leadership forced Leonard to examine his own assumptions about class, worth, and visibility. The old janitor had possessed wisdom and strength all along, but Leonard's prejudices had prevented him from recognizing these qualities. The lesson was painful but necessary, a humbling that taught Leonard to see people rather than functions, individuals rather than categories. The friendship that eventually developed between them was unprecedented in both their experiences. Leonard had never before connected personally with an employee so far below his social level, while Henry had never been treated as an equal by someone of Leonard's wealth and power. Their conversations ranged from practical building issues to philosophical discussions about fairness, dignity, and the meaning of successful living. Henry's perspective, shaped by decades of observation and reflection, offered Leonard insights that no board of directors could provide. Years later, as Henry approached his 70th birthday, the transformation of Caldwell Tower stood as testament to the power of seeing people clearly rather than through the distorting lens of prejudice and assumption. The building had become a model for humane workplace culture, attracting tenants who valued ethical leadership and social responsibility. Henry's innovations in maintenance and operations had been studied by property management companies throughout Manhattan, his quiet revolution inspiring changes in buildings across the city. The vase that had started everything was never replaced. Instead, its empty pedestal became a memorial to the danger of quick judgments and the importance of truth, a reminder that beautiful things could be destroyed by carelessness, but that human dignity, once restored, proved more durable than porcelain. Sometimes Leonard would stand in the gallery and remember the terrible morning when his blindness had cost him nearly everything, not just money, but honor and the respect of the one employee who truly understood how to care for what mattered. On the day Henry finally decided to retire, the building's staff and tenants gathered in the lobby for a ceremony that Leonard had insisted upon, despite Henry's preference for quiet departures. The old janitor, now 71 and silver-haired, stood surrounded by people whose lives he had touched through patient leadership and quiet example. His daughter Rosa had flown in from California with her children, who finally understood why their grandfather was beloved by people they had never met in a building they had never seen. Leonard's speech was brief but heartfelt, acknowledging not just Henry's professional contributions, but his role in teaching others about dignity, respect, and the value of seeing people clearly. "This building has been many things over the decades," Leonard said, his voice carrying across the marble lobby. "It has housed millions of dollars in transactions, cryptocurrency fortunes, real estate empires, and investment portfolios. But its greatest treasure was always the man who cared for it with such devotion that he became its soul." Henry's response was characteristically humble, thanking his colleagues and expressing hope that the building would continue to be a place where all people were valued, regardless of their position or background. He spoke of the joy he had found in work that mattered, in maintaining something beautiful and functional that served others' needs. His words carried the wisdom of someone who had learned that true success was measured not in dollars or assets, but in the positive impact one person could have on the lives of others. The reception that followed filled the gallery where the vase had once stood, its space now occupied by photographs showing the building's history and the many people who had contributed to its operation over the decades. Henry's image appeared in several photos, no longer invisible but recognized as integral to the story of Caldwell Tower. Children who had visited the building over the years remembered him with affection, while adults who had worked there spoke of lessons learned from his example. As the celebration continued into the evening, Henry found himself standing once again in the building's basement storage room, where he had discovered the evidence that changed everything. The old security equipment still hummed quietly in its corner, its magnetic tapes spinning their endless record of time passing through familiar spaces. Someone had installed a plaque near the door, reading "The Martinez Archive," honoring the institutional memory that Henry had embodied for 4 decades. Miriam joined him there, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the reception upstairs. At 43, she now ran her father's company with a leadership style learned partly from Henry's example, collaborative rather than authoritarian, attentive to details that others might miss, respectful of every person's contribution, regardless of their title or background. Her hedge fund had recovered from the market downturns and now focused on sustainable investments that considered social impact alongside financial returns. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, settling beside him on an old maintenance crate. "The years when no one saw you, when your contributions went unrecognized?" It was a question she had wanted to ask for months, part of her own process of understanding how so much wisdom and dignity could remain hidden in plain sight for so long. Henry considered her question with the thoughtfulness that marked all his responses to difficult topics. "Regret is a luxury I never learned to afford," he said finally. "Those years taught me who I was when no one was watching, how to find meaning in work that others considered insignificant. They showed me that dignity comes from within, not from external recognition. Without those years of invisibility, I wouldn't have been ready for the visibility that followed." His answer carried the hard-won wisdom of someone who had learned that character was forged in obscurity and tested by recognition, that true strength came from serving others without expectation of acknowledgement. The years of cleaning floors and maintaining equipment in silence had prepared him for leadership in ways that no management training could replicate. His authority came not from title or salary, but from demonstrated commitment to excellence and care for others. As they sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the mechanical sounds of a building at rest, Miriam understood that Henry's story was really about the countless invisible people who make civilization possible: the janitors and porters, the security guards and maintenance workers, the service employees who keep the world functioning while others receive credit for its achievements. Their contributions were rarely celebrated, their wisdom seldom consulted, their dignity often questioned by those who should have been grateful for their service. The final chapter of Henry's career had lasted 7 years, but its impact would endure far beyond his retirement. The young people he had mentored now carried his principles to other buildings and organizations, spreading his philosophy of respectful leadership and attentive care. The operational innovations he had developed became standard practices throughout the property management industry, improving working conditions for thousands of service employees. Most importantly, his example had changed how people thought about value and worth, visibility and recognition, the relationship between social position and human dignity. Leonard, now 72 and gradually transitioning business responsibilities to Miriam, often spoke of Henry as the person who had taught him to see clearly after decades of blindness induced by privilege and assumption. Their friendship had enriched both their lives in unexpected ways, proving that connections between people could transcend boundaries of class and background when mutual respect replaced prejudice. The millionaire's wealth had been measured in dollars and assets, but Henry's influence was measured in changed hearts and transformed perspectives. The night of Henry's retirement party, as the last guests departed and the building settled into quiet, Leonard walked through spaces that Henry had maintained for nearly 4 decades. Every surface bore the mark of care that went beyond duty, attention that transformed routine cleaning into acts of preservation and respect. The building would continue functioning under Henry's trained successors, but it would never again house the particular combination of wisdom, dedication, and quiet strength that Henry Martinez had brought to his work. In the months that followed, Henry divided his time between his modest apartment in Queens and volunteer work with organizations that supported immigrant families and working people struggling to find dignity in an economy that often valued them only for their labor. He taught English as a second language at the community center, sharing his own journey from invisible worker to respected leader as encouragement for others facing similar challenges. His story became legend in their community, proof that patient dignity and careful attention to excellence could eventually overcome prejudice and neglect. The letters that arrived at his apartment came from unexpected sources: former tenants of Caldwell Tower who remembered his kindness, business leaders who had implemented his operational methods, young people who had been inspired by his example to pursue careers in building management and facilities operations. Each letter reinforced the truth that Henry had always known but rarely expressed, that work performed with love and attention creates value far beyond its immediate function, that treating others with respect regardless of their position enriches everyone involved. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The New York City Department of Buildings announced the creation of the Henry Martinez Excellence in Facilities Management Award, recognizing building maintenance professionals who demonstrated exceptional dedication, innovation, and leadership in their field. The award would be presented annually to someone who embodied Henry's principles of respectful service, careful attention to detail, and commitment to making their workplace better for everyone who entered it. The first award ceremony took place in the grand ballroom of a Manhattan hotel, attended by property managers, building owners, and maintenance professionals from across the 5 boroughs. Henry sat at the head table, still uncomfortable with formal recognition, but understanding that his story had become larger than his personal experience. It represented hope for thousands of workers who remained invisible in their own buildings, who cleaned offices and maintained systems while dreaming of someday being seen as more than just part of the infrastructure. As Henry accepted the award that bore his name, he thought of Maria, his late wife, who had warned him about the wealthy people he worked for but had never lived to see him triumph over their blindness. He thought of his daughter Rosa, who had protected him during his darkest hours, and of his grandchildren in California, who now understood that their grandfather's quiet strength had accomplished something remarkable. Most of all, he thought of the young maintenance workers in the audience, seeing themselves, perhaps for the first time, not as invisible furniture, but as essential professionals whose contributions mattered. The award ceremony generated media attention that Henry found both gratifying and bewildering. Newspapers ran features about his story, focusing on the dramatic reversal from wrongful dismissal to respected leadership. Television news programs used his experience to explore broader themes about class, dignity, and the treatment of service workers in corporate America. Business journals analyzed his innovations in building management, while social media turned his story into a symbol of resilience and vindication. Yet, through all the publicity, Henry remained fundamentally unchanged, humble, thoughtful, and focused on practical matters rather than symbolic significance. When reporters asked him what he hoped people would learn from his experience, his answer was characteristically simple. See the people around you, really see them. Everyone has something valuable to offer if you take the time to notice. That philosophy continued to guide Henry as he entered his 70s, splitting his time between volunteer work and occasional consulting for property management companies seeking to implement his methods. His reputation in the industry had grown to the point where building owners would specifically request his advice on everything from operational efficiency to staff management. Young facilities managers sought him out as a mentor, learning not just technical skills, but the deeper wisdom of leading through respect rather than authority. The transformation of Caldwell Tower under Henry's leadership had been documented in case studies used by business schools and management training programs. Students learned about the power of inclusive leadership, the value of institutional knowledge, and the danger of making assumptions based on social position rather than individual merit. Henry occasionally spoke at these programs, sharing his insights with future business leaders who would shape workplace cultures in buildings across the country. But equally important were the smaller, more personal transformations that continued to ripple outward from Henry's example. Maintenance workers at other buildings began asserting their professional expertise more confidently, knowing that their knowledge and experience had value beyond their immediate tasks. Building managers started paying closer attention to the insights of their service staff, recognizing that people who worked closely with building systems often understood problems and solutions that escaped management attention. Leonard, meanwhile, had rebuilt his financial empire on a foundation of ethical practices and respectful leadership learned from Henry's example. His investment strategy now focused on companies that demonstrated fair treatment of workers and sustainable business practices. The Caldwell Group had become known in financial circles not just for profitable returns, but for principled operations that considered the human impact of business decisions. This reputation attracted clients who valued integrity alongside performance, creating a competitive advantage that Thomas Richardson's embezzlement scheme never could have achieved. The relationship between Leonard and Henry deepened over the years, evolving from employer and employee to genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared experiences. They met regularly for lunch at a small restaurant near the building, discussing everything from current events to philosophy, business strategy to personal memories. These conversations enriched both their lives, providing Leonard with perspectives he had never encountered in boardrooms and offering Henry insights into the complex challenges of running a major enterprise. Their friendship also served as a model for other relationships within the building, breaking down barriers between management and service staff that had existed for decades. Regular staff meetings now included representatives from all levels of the organization, ensuring that operational improvements considered perspectives from everyone who worked in the building. Annual company picnics and holiday parties became genuine community celebrations where janitors and executives socialized as equals, their children playing together while parents discussed shared concerns about education, healthcare, and retirement planning. The building itself had become a destination for executives and property managers who wanted to see Henry's innovations in action. Tours highlighted not just technical improvements, energy-efficient systems, predictive maintenance programs, advanced cleaning protocols, but the cultural changes that had transformed the workplace atmosphere. Visitors observed how staff members at all levels contributed ideas and took ownership of their work environment, creating a level of engagement and pride that translated directly into operational excellence. Henry's influence extended beyond Caldwell Tower through the mentorship program he established for young maintenance professionals throughout New York City. The program paired experienced workers with newcomers to the industry, providing technical training alongside professional development and career guidance. Henry insisted that the program include discussions about dignity, respect, and self-advocacy, teaching participants that their work was valuable and their voices deserved to be heard. Many of the program's graduates went on to leadership positions in property management, facilities operations, and even building ownership, carrying with them the principles Henry had taught about seeing people clearly and valuing contributions based on merit rather than social position. Some started their own maintenance companies built on foundations of fair wages, professional development, and respectful treatment of employees. Others became advocates within their organizations for better working conditions and recognition of service staff contributions. The impact of Henry's story reached far beyond the building management industry. inspiring similar transformations in hospitals, schools, hotels, and other institutions that relied on service workers to maintain their operations. Human resources departments began implementing training programs about unconscious bias and the importance of recognizing all employees' contributions. Labor unions used Henry's experience as an example of how workers could leverage their expertise and institutional knowledge to advance their careers and improve their working conditions. Educational institutions incorporated Henry's story into curricula about leadership, ethics, and workplace diversity. Business schools used his experience as a case study in organizational behavior, examining how assumptions about class and position could blind managers to valuable resources within their own organizations. High schools and community colleges included his story in programs designed to build students' self-confidence and professional aspirations, regardless of their intended career paths. As Henry entered his mid-70s, he began to consider his legacy more deliberately, thinking about how to ensure that the changes he had inspired would continue long after his direct involvement ended. He worked with Miriam to establish the Martinez Institute for Workplace Dignity, a non-profit organization dedicated to promoting respectful treatment of service workers and recognizing their professional contributions. The institute would provide training, advocacy, and research support for initiatives that improved working conditions and career opportunities for maintenance, security, and other service professionals. The Institute's first major project was a comprehensive study of building management practices across New York City, examining how different organizations approached staff development, recognition, and empowerment. The research revealed wide variations in treatment of service workers, from companies that still viewed them as invisible and replaceable to progressive organizations that had embraced inclusive leadership models. The study's recommendations became guidelines adopted by property management associations and incorporated into certification programs for building operations professionals. Henry also began working on his memoir, a project he had initially resisted but eventually embraced as a way to share lessons learned from his unique journey. The book would chronicle not just his personal experience, but the broader themes of dignity, respect, and the power of seeing people clearly that his story represented. He hoped it would inspire other workers who felt invisible in their organizations and encourage managers to examine their own assumptions about the people who served them. The writing process proved therapeutic for Henry, allowing him to reflect on the arc of his career and the meaning of the changes he had experienced and inspired. He wrote about the pain of being wrongfully accused and dismissed, but also about the satisfaction of vindication and recognition. He described the loneliness of decades spent unseen and unheard, balanced by the joy of finally being valued for his intelligence and contributions. Most importantly, he explored the lessons about human nature, social justice, and the possibility of transformation that his experience had taught him. The memoir's publication generated renewed interest in Henry's story and sparked conversations about workplace equality, recognition, and the treatment of service workers in corporate environments. Book clubs discussed the ethical implications of his experience, while business groups used it as a starting point for examining their own organizational cultures. The proceeds from book sales went to support the Martinez Institute's programs, ensuring that Henry's legacy would continue to create positive change for workers facing similar challenges. As his 75th birthday approached, Henry received an invitation that surprised and delighted him. The mayor of New York City requested his presence at a ceremony recognizing outstanding contributions to the city's workforce development and economic vitality. The event would honor individuals who had made significant impacts on improving working conditions, creating opportunities for advancement, and fostering respectful workplace cultures throughout the 5 boroughs. The ceremony took place at City Hall, attended by labor leaders, business executives, elected officials, and representatives from worker advocacy organizations. Henry sat among honorees who included union organizers, corporate executives, nonprofit directors, and government officials. a diverse group united by their commitment to creating better opportunities for working people. When his name was called, the standing ovation lasted several minutes, reflecting the widespread recognition his story had achieved throughout the city. Mayor's citation praised Henry not just for his professional innovations, but for his role in changing how society viewed and valued service workers. It acknowledged his transformation from invisible janitor to respected leader, as an example of the potential that exists within every person, regardless of their current position or social status. The citation concluded by recognizing his ongoing work through the Martinez Institute as a lasting contribution to workplace equity and human dignity. In his acceptance speech, Henry reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment of recognition. He spoke of Maria, his late wife, whose wisdom about wealthy employers had proven prophetic, but whose faith in his inherent dignity had sustained him through the darkest periods. He acknowledged Rosa, his daughter, whose protection during his crisis had provided the foundation for his eventual triumph. He thanked Leonard and Miriam Caldwell for having the courage to admit their mistakes and the wisdom to embrace meaningful change. But most eloquently, Henry spoke about the thousands of maintenance workers, security guards, cleaning staff, and other service professionals who continued to labor in invisibility, their contributions unrecognized and their voices unheard. He dedicated the honor to them, expressing hope that his story would inspire others to see these essential workers clearly and to value their humanity alongside their function. His words resonated throughout the packed auditorium, bringing many listeners to tears and generating sustained applause. Following the ceremony, Henry returned to Caldwell Tower for a quiet celebration with current and former colleagues. The building's marble lobby had been decorated with photographs chronicling his career, from early pictures showing him as a young maintenance worker to recent images of him consulting with building management teams across the city. Staff members from all levels of the organization attended, sharing stories about how Henry's leadership and example had influenced their own careers and perspectives. Leonard, now approaching 80 but still active in the family business, offered remarks that captured the profound change Henry had brought to their organization and their understanding of human worth. 40 years ago, Leonard said, I saw only a janitor when I looked at Henry Martinez. I saw uniform and equipment, function rather than person, service rather than wisdom. My blindness cost us both dearly, him his dignity and me the benefit of his insights for far too many years. But Henry's strength and patience eventually overcame my prejudice, teaching me that true leadership means seeing people clearly and valuing their contributions regardless of their position. Miriam followed with her own tribute, describing how Henry's example had shaped her approach to business leadership and human management. Under her direction, the Caldwell Group had become a model for ethical business practices, attracting clients and employees who valued integrity and respect alongside financial performance. The company's success demonstrated that doing business the right way, treating people with dignity, recognizing contributions fairly, creating inclusive cultures, was not just morally correct but economically advantageous. As the evening concluded, Henry found himself once more in the basement storage room, where he had discovered the evidence that changed everything. The old security equipment had finally been retired, replaced by modern digital systems, but the room remained as a memorial to the power of institutional memory and careful observation. A new plaque honored not just Henry's discovery, but the principle it represented, that truth has a way of emerging from forgotten corners when patient people look carefully enough to find it. Standing in that familiar space, surrounded by colleagues who had become friends and surrounded by the mechanical sounds of a building he had served for 44 years, Henry felt a profound sense of completion. His journey from invisible janitor to recognized leader was ending, but the changes he had inspired would continue long after his direct involvement ended. The Martinez Institute would carry on his work, training programs would spread his principles, and most importantly, People who had learned to see clearly would teach others to do the same. The final entry in Henry's memoir, written on his 76th birthday, reflected on the unexpected turns his life had taken and the lessons learned along the way. He wrote about the pain of being misjudged and the joy of vindication, the loneliness of invisibility and the responsibility of recognition, the satisfaction of work well done and the fulfillment of making a positive difference in others' lives. But above all, he wrote about the fundamental truth his experience had taught him, that every person possesses dignity and worth that transcends their social position, and that recognizing this truth enriches everyone involved. I was never just a janitor, Henry concluded his memoir, though being a janitor was never just anything. I was a human being who happened to clean floors for a living, who maintained beautiful spaces because I understood that beauty requires care, who served others because service performed with love creates value that extends far beyond its immediate purpose. My story is not unique except in its recognition. There are thousands of Henry Martinez's working in buildings across this city, their contributions unnoticed, their wisdom untapped, their dignity unacknowledged. I hope my experience encourages others to see these essential workers clearly, to value their humanity alongside their function, and to understand that treating people with respect regardless of their position creates better workplaces and a better world for everyone. And have you ever felt invisible while you were the one holding everything together? Have you cleaned floors that others walked across without seeing you, maintained systems that functioned so well that nobody noticed your contribution, solved problems that others created without receiving credit for your solutions? Tell me your story in the comments below. Your wisdom matters, your experience has value, and your dignity deserves recognition regardless of your job title or the size of your paycheck. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so it reaches someone else who needs to hear that their quiet contributions make the world a better place. Share it with someone who works behind the scenes, who keeps things running smoothly while others take credit, who maintains the spaces where important things happen. For more stories that celebrate the dignity of overlooked people and the power of patient truth, check the podcast link in the description. Thank you for walking with us through Henry's journey from invisible janitor to visible leader, from scapegoat to respected advisor, from the margins of other people's stories to the center of his own. Remember, you don't need an expensive suit to have dignity. You don't need a corner office to possess wisdom, and you don't need recognition from others to know your worth. Sometimes the most important person in the building is the one with worn hands and a quiet voice who sees everything, remembers everything, and cares for everything with the devotion of someone who understands that small acts of service, performed with love, can change the world one marble floor at a time. We'll see you in the next story.